Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, as I owe a huge debt to the Hertz Fellowship because, frankly, without it, I'm not sure I would have been able to finish graduate school. What I was doing was so unusual at the time. My chances of getting funding, I thought, were zero, and so I was amazed when I got my Hertz Fellowship. Um, so this is my new book. Uh, I'm gonna tell you about my book. The book represents, in some ways, my life work. It's my life work focused on what I've been doing for the last 25 years, which is what's called complexity economics, and which I'll explain to you in a minute. Um, my book, I tried to make it fun to read, to have a storyline, people like that. Um, but I think it's a firsthand account of a scientific revolution in progress. I've been through several scientific revolutions. Chaotic dynamics was one, complex systems is another, and I view this as a third one that I'm participating in. And so it's sort of a real-time account from the trenches. Um, I would argue that economics needs to be doing more of what I'm talking about here. I bent over backwards in the book not to be critical of economics because I don't want the book to be about criticizing something. I want it to be a positive and constructive uh, store, uh, vision of what we could be doing and that would help the world and help us do things better. Um, so I don't know, some of you may have taken economics classes in your careers or might even be economists. That would be great. If so, I'd love to get questions or challenges from you. Um, but and let me just emphasize that today I'm talking not about economics as a data analysis tools, what's called econometrics in economics, but rather theory in economics. And all theories follow a certain template that I've outlined here. When an economist wants to make a theory, the economist assigns each agent a utility function, which is a kind of scorecard describing what they prefer. Each agent has a model of the world. So what information do they have access to? What calculations are they capable of doing? So the benchmark model is actually what's come to be called rational expectations, which means you're like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. You can do everything and calculate anything, and you're extremely rational. And you're going to use that to maximize your utility. But behavioral economics has been one of the major revolution or paradigm shifts in economics over the last 20 or 30 years, and it's shown the deficiencies in that. Those deficiencies, when it comes to the workhorse models that places like the Fed or um, Treasury departments use around the world, um, they're still basically using rational expectations because nobody really understands. There's no agreed upon alternative yet. Um, and then they assume supply equals demand, and they assume each agent selfishly maximizes their own utility, though taking the other agents into account. And then they write down equations for that and actually deduce the decisions from the equations that maximize the utility of each agent. And they say, okay, everybody does this, and what does that mean for the economy? So that's how a standard model works. So now I'm going to show you something different that's very different. It differs on all of these points. Um, and it's what we're calling complexity economics. I'm not sure it's the best name. It doesn't necessarily mean that certainly doesn't mean everything has to be complicated. Really, it refers to the fact that it's coming out of complex system science. And I'll say more about what that is in general in a minute. But I thought I'd start out by just telling a story of a model we built to understand the effects of the COVID pandemic. And I want to highlight the modeling team. Uh, when the pandemic was just getting started back in February, maybe early March, late February of 2020, I uh, I realized this was going to be a big deal. I sent everybody in my group home because I didn't want them to get sick. I actually got chastised for the university for doing that without it being official university policy. But as a result, none of us got very sick early on. Um, but anyway, I put together my best team of students, ex-students, and postdocs, and we did a crash program for a couple of months to build a model of COVID and with the goal of advising the UK government about lockdown policies. Um, so uh, we, the model we built predicted the economic effect of COVID on the UK economy, industry by industry. We tested several different lockdown policies. We found a least bad policy, which was to keep all the upstream industries open. I'll explain what that means in a moment, but close the customer-facing industries. The UK government took the policy we recommended. I can't say they did it because we recommended it, but they did take that one. Um, and and our model predicted, just as an example, our model made a lot of predictions. I'll say more in a minute. But for instance, we predicted that the second quarter GDP loss in 2020 would be 21.5%. And a year later, when the measurements came in, the reality was 22.1%. So our model did pretty well. Now, how did it work? And well, so first of all, I'm showing you the UK production network, the UK economy. The left side of this picture is what would be called the upstream industries like agriculture, fishing, forestry, mining, the industries that bring raw materials into the economy. And the right side of this is what's called the downstream part, which would be uh, consumer-facing industries. And, and so our model was about understanding what COVID would do industry by industry and how the shock that COVID gave to the economy would propagate through this network that I'm showing you here. And by the way, in the network, the size of the circles is the size of each industry in the economy. And the lines are the connections because typical industry makes stuff and sells it to another industry, particularly on the left side of the diagram. Um, Now, how did our model work? It's very simple, actually. We assumed that industries can't produce the goods they want to produce, or they normally produce if they lack labor, if they lack demand, or if they lack the essential inputs that they need to produce that good. So essential inputs here means if you're producing steel, you need iron, you need coke, you need energy. But you know, in the input-output table, there's also restaurants and management consultants. You can get by for a few months without those kind of things. Um, and then we just gave each industry an inventory of the goods it normally used to produce what it needed. And and every day we would ask how much can the industry produce, which also determines how much of their inventory they used up. And we just did that day by day. And um, and that's it. Now, let me say a little bit about how we had to calculate a shock. That is, here's the network, but you realize in COVID, it was a very sudden shock. Um, it was a shock both to the demand side. Airlines stayed open, but people stopped flying because they didn't deem it prudent. Um, there was a shock to labor because a lot of people couldn't go to work because they were in danger of getting infected. And and as the pandemic developed, industries started running out of the stuff they needed to make things. So we just tracked that. Now, to show you how we estimated the labor shock, which we predicted in advance, Maria and Penny, two members of the team I showed you before, are experts on occupational labor and how workers move from one occupation to another. We'd written a couple of papers about that, but then we realized there's the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US makes a wonderful table, fine grained resolution about occupations, as you can see from the list of occupations sampled here, um, had key statistics about occupations, such as how close together do people in this occupation typically work. So if they work close together, we bet they weren't going to be able more than 2 meters or less than 2 meters, that they wouldn't be able to go to work. So that's one of the main ways we estimated the labor shock. And and because we could then estimate which occupations couldn't go to work, then we had a map of which occupations work in each industry, so we could see how each industry was going to be affected, and therefore get the shocks, the supply shocks to the industries. Um, and this is the output the model made. Um, you see time running along the horizontal axis and gross output of the UK on the vertical axis. Before the lockdown, we assumed that everything was just business as usual. So that's the black line you see. And that black line is our model's prediction of the overall economic impact on gross output. The colored lines are what happens industry by industry. So you can see as you go from left to right that the first lockdown was imposed in during March. Um, and so there was immediate hit to production, at least predicted by our model. Then time flows along. And, and by the way, we were making this prediction just before the second dashed line, which is where the first lockdown ended. And the question was, what was the UK government going to replace the first hard lockdown by? How open would things be? And so, and that's what we were predicting. And so you can see we did quite well because the solid black lines are prediction, and these black dots are what the economy actually did um, as measured a year later once all the data had been collected and processed. And we got pretty close. Quarter by quarter, we even got the time profile of the shock reasonably well. Um, and by the way, you'll notice that what the model's doing, if you follow some of those colored lines along, some of them, like there's a dark blue line that runs along unscathed for the first couple of weeks, and then it takes a plunge. Why is that? Well, because that industry ran out of its essential inputs. So they had to take a hit to production. So we could do that industry by industry. And in fact, when you look industry by industry, we didn't get everything exactly right. What this panel shows is what actually happened, which is on the horizontal axis, versus what our model predicted would happen. This is a snapshot taken at the first month. And again, the size of the circles is the size of the industry and the economy. If the predictions had been perfect, they would all be just lined up along the diagonal line there. But you can see they weren't perfect, but some were on one side, some were on the other. But by economic standards, this is a pretty good prediction, and the correlation's pretty high. And since then, we've gone on to build even better models, um, actually teaming up with epidemiologists. So we built a model for the New York area where we could take advantage of things like 500,000 volunteers who let their mobile phones be tracked during the pandemic. And so half of the team above are epidemiologists and the other half are us doing the economics. And the epidemiological model and the economic model actually swap information day by day as it goes along to keep track of what's going on in the pandemic and how that's affecting the economy and vice versa. Now, so this model that I just showed you might seem like common sense. If you're a physical scientist, a biologist, you'd probably go, well, yeah, I mean, that's the way I would do it. But as I tried to explain in the first panel, that's not how economists do things. This model is, you could never publish a paper in a mainstream journal about a model like this because economic models have to follow that template that I mentioned at the beginning. Now, let me now make some general remarks. So that model is an example of what's now coming to be called complexity economics, which is applying complex systems thinking and methods to economics. It's building on the science of complex systems, a movement I helped start, starting in the mid 80s when I was at Los Alamos. I had the first complex systems group at Los Alamos. And complex systems is about the study of emergent behavior. That is, it's a study of situations where the system as a whole behaves qualitatively different than the individual components. So if you take, for example, a neuron is a cell, you put an electrical stimulus into the cell, it may or may not emit another electrical stimulus. If I just showed you a neuron and I said, what do you think you can do with this? Oh, you might have made some guesses about something, might have even recognized it has information processing capabilities, but it would not be at all obvious that you could hook 80 billion of them together in the right way and get the human brain. And there are many other good examples of complex systems. One of the best is also the economy. As Adam Smith famously observed in 1776, um, the in the economy we specialize, and because we specialize, we're able to all live better than we could if we didn't specialize, if we all tried to do everything by ourselves on our own. And so it's another example of an emergent system. Um, in complexity economics, unlike in mainstream economics, we believe in simulation as the sort of workhorse tool. It's not the only thing we do, but it's usually the starting point. That is, we try and mimic the economy on a computer. And we build what are called agent-based models, which are simulations involving decision makers. That is, decision makers have agency. They're making choices. We typically assume bounded rationality. That is, we assume people make decisions using rules of thumb or reasoning a few steps ahead, but certainly not being able to reason out every problem they're presented with. And we also can model the economy out of equilibrium. We don't have to assume necessarily that supply equals demand or that everybody's strategies are lined up. This idea of bounded rationality and of doing things this way dates back to somebody called Herbert Simon from the 1960s, who got a Nobel Prize in economics. Simon was an amazing polymath. He's also one of the founders of artificial intelligence, political science, management science, wrote 1,600 papers during his career. Um, but but what he advocated didn't really catch on. Um, so we're picking that up. Uh, as I said, with agent-based models where we use heuristics. Heuristics could be things like buy undervalued assets or copy, look around you and look at who's doing the best and copy them. Or it could be trial and error. Try something. If it doesn't work, try something else. Um, we also sometimes use set up agents with goals, but we use imperfect learning and imperfect logic based on feasible information where we don't necessarily assume everything's optimal. And we model the dynamics by simulation, which might or might not converge to equilibrium. And we model everything from the bottom up. We model the individual agents as, as much as we can. And I try to follow what I call the principle of verisimilitude, that is trying to model the economy as is rather than as if. And as if here refers to the fact that there's several ways in which the standard modeling tools don't match what people actually do. Economists like to say, well, let's assume it's as if they did it that way. And if the model makes good predictions, that's good enough. The predictions have been mixed, so I don't think it has been good enough. A key distinction here is relates to what we sometimes call the wilderness of bounded rationality. So this echoes advice, or let's say this phrase, wilderness of bounded rationality, refers to advice that young students who go to their mainstream advisors and say, gee, I'm kind of intrigued by this agent-based modeling business. Um, what is it okay? And they will advise them not to do it if they're interested in having successful careers. And because, and the quantitative, the substantive reason that's given is beware of being lost in the wilderness of bounded rationality. That is, the human brain, which is sort of depicted back there, and in fact, not just the human brain, all the human brains in the economy are complicated. The way people actually make decisions is complicated. We don't have enough understanding to really do that right. So that's why we start at what I think of as the rationality gate. We assume people are all rational, and then we venture into this wilderness, but keeping the rationality gate in sight so that we don't get lost. That would be the mainstream view. We complexity economists, in contrast, often enter through what you might call the zero intelligence gate. I have several models where I assume people make decisions by just flipping coins or throwing darts. And then maybe start there and then say, well, okay, let's do something a little smarter. Let's give them some heuristics that are appropriate for their setting. Let's give them a learning algorithm. Let's let them reason a few steps ahead. And so we go into that wilderness from the other side. I think, um, hopefully we can meet in the middle because we all both have the same goal. Um, Complexity economics is in transition. Since Herb Simon's day, we have computers that are a billion times more powerful, vastly better data, better understanding of human behavior, better understanding of how to build agent-based models, better understanding of complex systems more generally. And so I think the time is ripe for this to take off, and we're seeing signs of that. Until recently, agent-based models were qualitative tools where they model me too, we would model generic economies at a generic point in time, do things to make sure the model was producing reasonable predictions, and then make qualitative statements about the world based on that. But we now have several examples of quantitative agent-based models. I just presented you with one in the introduction that was actually used for decision making and gave good answers in real time before anybody knew the answers. We model a specific economy at a specific point in time, make quantitative conditional predictions, and evaluate policies quantitatively. A big advantage of agent-based modeling is that it's more tractable. That is, standard models, because they're doing optimizing and because the space over which you have to optimize things can get very complicated, it can become impossible to solve the equations if you have more than, say, 10 agents in these models. And actually, more typically, there's 2 or 3 kinds of agents. In contrast, in ABMs, we can have millions of agents, and we can realistically put economic structure into our model and model more interacting things. They're now quantitative agent-based macro models, meaning models of the whole economy, but they're also micro models because they model things from the ground up. We've built one ourselves, and so there's now a competing field of agent-based modelers building macro models, and they're beginning to be adopted by central banks. There are 2 or 3 central banks now that have these kind of models in addition to their normal models. We've also built models for other things. I should make a list here, but I haven't. But for example, housing market models, they're now used, at least 10 central banks now use models derived from the ones we built early on to think about their housing markets. We are in the process of building an integrated climate economics model. I show a schematic diagram here. We're building out each piece, trying to make sure we understand how that piece works, and we're beginning to hook the pieces together and focusing on the climate transition. And here are some of the other projects we're involved in, looking at technology costs and applying that to the climate transition, looking at energy investments. We're building an agent-based model where we actually, for every energy company in the world, we have an agent, and we initialize the model with all the power plants those agents have, and then we model the decisions they make to drill new oil wells or build another solar farm as they move, and that allows us to think about the climate transition. Looking at models of occupational labor to avoid having stranded labor, as we saw in West Virginia from coal miners. So trying to avoid that during the transition, looking at supply network shocks like COVID, and even simulating the American stock market. So these are various projects my students and my company are doing. The company is there to try and scale these ideas up, reduce them to practice. So we're making predictions day in and day out. If somebody asks, well, what do you think about this recent news event? Our model is running and can talk about it. And we really want to get this out in the public domain as much as we can, and so it can be used to guide us to a better future. And I think that's probably a good place for me to end the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doyne. Yeah. I also want to highlight that just before this, Doyne finished giving another talk at New York's Climate Week. So we're extra grateful that he's able to make some time to share these insights with us. So with that, we're going to transition over into Q&A mode. And I know this is something our community relishes greatly. So thank you already for everyone who's submitted questions, and keep them coming, and we'll get to them roughly in the order that you submit. So yes, and we're dropping that link repeatedly into chat here. So head on over and send in some more questions. So we have many already, and I'll start off with a couple of here. So let's see. Yeah, so I like this one about kind of developing an academic community around this. So this is coming from Cooper Jacobus at UC Berkeley. So, Doyne, how can incoming graduate students find the intellectual climates and funding to
Ah,
pursue interdisciplinary topics like chaos, complexity, artificial life is listed as well? Is it possible to create research communities that are around these interdisciplinary questions?
yeah, there are many communities these days, um, uh, and they operate, I would say, a bit around the edges of the mainstream scientific efforts, but they become more and more accepted. Um, the Santa Fe Institute, where I was for many years, is one of the
Mhm.
hubs of complex systems thinking. But there are many universities with complex systems institutes, University of Michigan, Northwestern, um, Rob Axtell's group on computational social science at George Mason University. And there are several really good groups in Europe as well. Our group at Oxford, it's a group in Vienna run by Stefan Turner. Um, so, so the groups are out there. Careers in these areas are the harder thing to come by because
Mm.
it's jobs that are the limiting factor. I warn all my students before I take them that if their goal is to get on the economics faculty at Harvard, they should go somewhere else. Um, but I've still done reasonably well placing my students. I have a student at the World Bank, a student at the International Monetary Fund, student at the Bank of Spain. Um, I've hired a lot of my ex-students now at Macrocosm and in various postdocs and so on around the world. Several of them have faculty positions, but not in economics departments, in logistics departments or informatics departments, and those kind of places often are open to that kind of thing. So it is possible to have a career, but I have to say you're carrying a handicap relative to others, as I experienced in my own career, I would say.
Mhm. Well, thank you for that. Uh, yeah, kind of aligns with, I think, a common experience in the Hertz community that, let's say, the traditional academic departments are not the only way to have a big influence, and they can sometimes be unwelcoming to off the wall directions. So I'll jump into the next question from Isaac Metcalf at Rice University. So, what insights does your economic model give to the validity of modern monetary theory? And this is a theory that argues that currency issuing governments like the US are never at risk of defaulting, and that suggests that federal jobs guarantees as a mechanism to control inflation could help things out in the economy.
Yeah. Well, I regret to say I can't give a good answer to that. That's a kind of question we would like to address with our macro model, but it's quite new. We're just publishing I mean, one of, any day now we'll finally put our first paper about that model online. And we're going to have to spend still probably another year debugging various things and expanding the model before I can get to that question. It's a great question. And, and but I'm sorry, I just can't answer it.
No, of course. I wonder if you could offer some kind of thoughts in a broader scope. Are there particular branches of economic theory that you think make predictions that might end up aligning more closely with results of agent-based models than others?
Well, yeah, there are. Um, the but maybe to take the question in a slightly different direction, one of the things we try to focus on are places where we can answer questions the other models can't even ask.
Hmm.
So I mentioned, for example, our housing model. We actually simulated housing markets. So we had, people owning houses, they could rent them or buy them. They could, but if they decided they wanted to buy a house, they would go to the bank, try and get a loan. So we really did the mechanics that anybody who's ever bought a house would be very familiar. Mainstream models can't even ask those kind of questions, and we were able to look at policies about questions like, was the housing bubble caused more by interest rate changes or by lax credit? If so, how could we do it better? So we could address all those kind of questions because for us, a policy is just a little block of code in the simulation. Um, and I think there certainly are places where we line up with mainstream models. Um, we have several papers on what are called leverage cycles. And there was a nice synergy between the mainstream models providing some ideas that we then tested in a more quantitative way. So I do see the two things as being synergistic and complementary, though
Mhm.
competitive as well.
Mhm. That's economically appropriate, I feel. Um, a question coming in here about data. So this is from Lorenzo Cacioppote from Purdue. So to make models of this nature, it seems like a lot of data about many different industries is needed. How does one go about finding this data? So there's historical data that might be accessible, but what's the state of
Yeah.
contemporary data on the contemporary economy?
Well, that's a very perceptive question because data is a big headache. We spend a lot of time and effort getting data, buying data, developing relationships so people will give us data. Um, and and our models are very data hungry because we want to make them realistic. So we want to match things up. One of the advantages we have over mainstream models is actually because we're fine grained, oftentimes you can get very fine grained data. I mentioned the our model of energy investment. We have the advantage that we have a 25-year history with 90% of the energy plants in the world and their owners. And we can see how it changes year by year with lots of information about what they had in them. So we have the advantage that we can actually build our model by testing on that data and ingesting all that data into the model as the initial condition. So, which I think gives us a big advantage because then we can get a lot closer to realism. But doing this requires a huge effort. We often end up, well, buying data sets. We have to merge the data sets together sometimes. Sometimes we have to collect the data ourselves. It's a big problem.
Mhm.
It also doesn't help that, there's machinery set up by the government to collect data, but it's set up to collect the kind of data and present that data at the level that mainstream models use the data. We want the
Mhm.
data in a much more fine-grained and comprehensive level than is provided by the government agencies generally. Though I mentioned the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who gave us exactly what we needed for our COVID model.
Mhm. To follow up on that, do you envision working directly with government econometrics agencies to sort of to get access to some of the data they may not be publishing?
We would love to do that. Um, you know, the only problem is it just always requires developing a relationship.
Mhm.
And um, and so we haven't had the time to do that, say, with the federal agencies that would be relevant. But we are very interested in do that. We've done that actually somewhat with the Bank of England and the ECB, where we got access to special data. And I'm pleased to say that the head of the National Statistics Office in um, in the UK read my book and actually approached us, and they're very keen and to work with us. So we're very excited about those possibilities.
Mhm. That's very good to hear. I'm going to selfishly sneak one of my own questions in here. So I'm a mathematician by trade, and I'm curious about some of the kind of the abstract, say, complexity theory descriptions of emergent behavior you mentioned early on. So it seems that this agent-based modeling that you've described is relying on kind of simulation as its primary means of exploring the system, and you mentioned that that's kind of the foundation of your approach. Um, I'm curious, if you have a given complex system where there's some emergent behavior that we're interested in, but maybe we don't understand at a fine mechanistic level, um, why should we expect that when we simulate the system, the simulation is going to give us, comparable emergent behavior? Maybe we have kind of missed something entirely.
Yeah, well, sometimes we do, but that's a good way to find out. If
Mhm.
if you do the simulation and you don't get the emergent behavior you expect, you know you need to put something else in. A good
Hmm.
example of that is understanding the brain. There was a big project funded in Europe. I think a €500 million were spent on what was called the Blue Brain Project, based in Lausanne, but a pan-European project. The goal was, let's just use big computing, throw everything at it, understand the brain. That project failed. I think they're just missing key ingredients. Um, but in other areas, like the COVID model I showed you, or uh, they're pretty good simulations of ants, for example, ant colonies, which exhibit very rich emergent behavior. Um, so there are successful examples where emergence has been achieved that matches and is useful to understand what's going on. But uh, and let me also just mention that there's also theory. Uh, it tends to follow a simulation, um, and that theory, unlike the economic theories I mentioned, often comes from statistical mechanics and physics. A lot of physicists have been interested in this kind of thing, and evolutionary biology and ecology have also been very useful. I have a theory I call the theory of market ecology, that the stock market simulation I mentioned simulates actually what mutual funds do. And uh, so, every quarter, fundamentals flow in. We make a guess. We reverse engineer in a weak way what each mutual fund is going to buy or sell, and we iterate that going along. And there we were blessed by the fact that the SEC requires mutual funds to report all their holdings once a quarter. So we can see what they've actually done historically and therefore get a somewhat calibrated model. Now, I mean, I don't think we're going to beat the stock market with that model, but we can certainly simulate what the market's doing. And the long-term goal is to understand, say, somebody comes along with a new security like mortgage-backed securities and says, oh, we've got this great new thing. Well, oftentimes there are side effects, as we saw in the crisis of 2008. We could simulate the market and discover that without having to actually do the experiment in reality.
Hmm. I like that. Thank you. Following up on the COVID model in particular, Neil Jablon, a Hertz Fellow, was interested in knowing how the COVID economic model performed outside the time frame that you showed. Did you continue running it afterwards?
No,
Okay.
we knew the model we built actually doesn't have prices in it. It was really literally a model of the shocks and the physical flows through the economy, and production was the key thing that we were modeling. Um, but we didn't have prices, and we actually said when we wrote the paper, we were worried about inflation. Our model doesn't deal with it. We think for the first year it's not going to be a problem, but after that, all bets are off. And uh, so in that regard, we were right, but we didn't stick our neck out about what we thought was going to happen after the first year.
Hmm. Sure. Let's see. A question from David Hoyos at Memorial Sloan Kettering, who first wants to thank you for a great talk. So David points out that on the one hand, when you're interpreting and building these models, it's great to incorporate the most recent data possible. But on the other hand, that can be very time-consuming, finicky, expensive to update models constantly as new data is coming in. So do you have kind of rules of thumb for when it's most advantageous to update models with new data and when you can kind of let them go and spare the expense?
Yeah. Well, so there's two kinds of updating one wants to do. One is initial conditions. You know, we take our macro model, we say, this is what we think the state of the economy is now. We go forward, let's say a quarter or a year, making predictions about what's going to happen. Our predictions, of course, are not going to be exactly right. And then we update the model by ingesting the new initial condition based on more recent measurements. So that's something you just have to do on a regular basis. Um, it's actually not trivial in this domain because if you we only have partial information about the state of the economy. We don't get to see things at the micro scale. And so if we do it in the wrong way, it can actually cause problems for the model. So now, the other kind of updating is new data comes in, so let's readjust the parameters of the model. And that you can decide how often you want to do that, but things in the economy typically happen pretty slowly, slow enough that we will be updating the models all the time in both senses.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's a fun one from Paul Deaton at MIT. So a 1972 MIT econometric study predicted societal collapse around 2040. And more recent studies by KPMG and others have reached similar conclusions. If you all have reached different conclusions, what factors account for the difference?
Yeah. So I think he's referring to the limits to growth study and the Club of Rome uh, that made several predictions starting in the 70s using what are called system dynamics models. So those are models that are systems of coupled first order differential equations. And they're great for understanding qualitative things and feedbacks. And there's actually a really nice model by John Sterman's group at MIT, which is a descendant of that effort, that's called En-ROADS, that's been very useful for helping people think about the climate transition. But those models are hard to calibrate against data. They're a little too different than the way things really are. And they don't give you the flexibility to deal with discontinuous effects and other things that we can do in agent-based models more easily. Um, so, so they're sort of designed for a different purpose. Now, we 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 can't say that we've run our model forward to, understand whether the world's going to collapse or not. That's not what we're trying to do right now. But we have been looking at a lot of data about the climate change and the green energy transition and trying to understand based on past technological transitions what the future is likely to hold. And our results from that are pretty optimistic. That is, what we see is that when people say, "Oh, we're not moving fast enough on climate," well, that's part because people don't think in exponential terms. When you plot everything on log scale, we're actually making pretty good progress. And so my forecast there is we're going to uh, see in the next 5 or 10 years, suddenly we'll see really rapid movement because the exponential trends that have been in place and have been going for decades now are going to finally fully enter the stage because exponentials are small and they're small and they're small and then suddenly they get big. And so we have a pretty optimistic outlook, at least for climate change and the energy transition.
It's very encouraging to hear. It's a subject near and dear to my heart. I wonder, kind of in that direction, have you applied similar models to past transformations of the energy system to kind of see how well they captured rates of change historically?
Well, actually, since you're asking me that, maybe maybe I should show you a slide, which was the next slide I had in my deck that I didn't show. Let me go, oops, wait, sorry, I've got to hit play up here. Play. Oh, good. All right. So here's the slide I would have shown. This is the history of the global energy system over the last 140 years. We worked hard to put this together. And on the right, well, what do we show? We show different energy technologies. We plot on the vertical axis the amount of useful energy they either supply or what the cost of that energy is per megawatt hour. And we then show different technologies, and everything is on log scale, meaning the tick marks are powers of 10. And so what you can see on the right is you see past energy transitions, like on the top left of the right panel, you see coal overtaking traditional biomass. So that happened in 1880. And, by a few decades later, it was an order of magnitude more, supplying an order of magnitude more energy than traditional biomass. You also see oil and gas, the dashed black line and dashed gray lines, entering on the left, and rising exponentially because in this kind of plot, exponentials are straight lines. Um, and achieving parity with coal around 1970. But you see this new stuff. If you look on the lower side of the diagram, you see solar energy, the orange line, um, hydrogen-based fuels, the green line, batteries, the purple line, wind, blue, all of them are shooting up at exponential rates. And that's what I was talking about when I said, I think it's going to start to happen faster than people think. Because if you just draw lines through those, and we've been working hard to find good ways to draw lines through those because uh, technologies follow something called S-curves. And we've collected huge amounts of data about past transitions and looked at them. We can show that they're all remarkably similar in the shape. They just differ in the speed and the levels they reach. But the good news is that if you extrapolate these things forward, it seems probable that solar and wind and batteries are all going to uh, arrive at very meaningful levels within the next um, decade. And on the left is cost. And once again, you see something very interesting. Um, Oil and coal and gas, which are the dashed black line and brown lines, uh, they bump around a lot. They're volatile, but the long-term trends are pretty flat. Uh, Coal costs about the same now as it did a century ago. In contrast, solar energy, that orange line there, is coming down at, on average, about 10% per year, has been on average since it was created and first commercially used in 1958. It's a factor of 10,000 cheaper than it was when the Vanguard satellite was built. So there's been huge progress. And based on our analysis of technologies, we think the exponential trends you see in the right will continue for a while. They'll start to flatten out soon, but still growing very fast. And the exponential trends in costs will keep dropping, and energy will get cheaper than it's ever been. And it will be clean energy. Now, the biggest challenge is storage. Storage technologies are lagging behind, though they also show favorable trends. And that's the key thing we need to be focused on supporting going forward. So hopefully that was a useful diversion.
It was. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's see. We had a nice personal connection here. So this is from Bob Mackey, excuse me, a Hertz Fellow, um, who thanks you for talk and notes that you crossed paths at Los Alamos when he was working for Brosel Haslacher and
Ah,
Tsutomu Shimomura. So hello again from
welcome.
Bob. So Bob's interested about the connections between the models you're developing and what he terms the current fad for large language models and
Ah,
AI.
yeah.
So, are those technologies useful for your modeling, or do they obscure the parameters and variables that you're interested in?
They're certainly useful in some ways. They may be more useful in others. Um, we've used large language models, for example, if we want to map patents to the companies that use the patents, as opposed to the ones that own the patents, which you can just look up in a table. Large language models have helped us do that kind of task. And so they're often very useful in helping understand data better. Um, uh, there's actually an effort afoot. One of postdocs and our group has worked on is to use large language models to come up with better models of human decision making. Humans are imperfect decision makers. You can train a large language model to ask, try and make decisions like a person would in this context. And so that's an area of active investigation right now. And this is maybe a good opportunity, though, to say that these models, our agent-based models, are really different than artificial intelligence models in that we put strong prior information into them. We build in the structure of the world. We build in the causal mechanisms by hand. And, and so in situations where you don't have as much data, they don't need as much data as those models. And secondly, they can answer questions in situations where maybe we haven't seen the past. Machine learning models, they assume the future will be like the past. and we can get around that.
Hmm.
So
Thank you for that. So we're coming up toward the end of the hour, and I do want to take a moment to interrupt the discussion here. So a first note, which is that Doyne has very kindly agreed to stay on after the hour for another 10 minutes or so to continue taking questions. So if you're available and interested in sticking around, we'd love to have you. But we understand many of you have busy lives. You need to take off sharply at the end of the hour. So want to thank you all for joining today. And of course, a big particular thanks to Doyne for doing a kind of double header talk here. And he's working in some lunch, which he had to skip, unfortunately, to speak with us today. So again, we're really grateful to you, Doyne, for taking that time, for sharing your insights and the results of your models with us today. So let's all give Doyne a big distributed round of applause here.
my pleasure. Thanks to everybody.